Take another minute of silence in the King's presence. Shabbat Shalom. For those who don't know me, my name is Richard Cleary. I'm one of the elders here at Kingdom Living Messianic Congregation. If you're a guest, we just want to welcome you. So glad that you're here with us. We hope that you feel welcomed by the Lord in this service and just experiencing His presence and feeling the love that He has for you here. I just was reflecting as we were in silence that I just saw Yeshua, the King's face, smiling over us. And He was glad to be with us. And He was delighting in His people. So we're just thankful for you, Yeshua. We're thankful for your face that shines on us, that we get to know our Abba Father through your face shining on us. Just pray that you would bless your people today, that you would speak to your people, that you would encourage and build up your people. For your glory, amen. Today, we're going to talk about what we are made for. What did God create image bearers for? That question is foundational to why our congregation exists, why Kingdom Living Messianic Congregation exists, is rooted in the answer to what did God create His image bearers for? Really simply, God created His image bearers for the King and His kingdom. We were created for the King and His kingdom. More nuanced, we could say we were created for the Father. We were created for His Son. We were created to live by His inbreathed Spirit in the kingdom of God. But to keep it short and simple, I'm saying we were created for the King and His kingdom. Now I want to unpack that by looking at a portrait from the story of God. And that portrait really begins in the book of Genesis, chapter 1 and chapter 2. And I want to get more specific to what it means to be created for the King and His kingdom as image bearers, and give us three basic reasons that help us understand what it means to be created for the King and His kingdom. What did God create image bearers for? Number one, he created his image bearers for Eden. Number two, he created his image bearers for relationship. And number three, he created his image bearers for rulership. So that's what we're going to talk about today. How human beings, image bearers, were created for the king and his kingdom. They were created for Eden, to live in heaven on earth. They were created for relationships with God and his people. And they were created for rulership. This has to do with our stewardship of creation, of sharing in the rule and reign of the king, cultivating and watching over what the king has entrusted to us. So starting with the first point, we were created for Eden. God made image bearers to live in a home, to live in Eden. Eden is where heaven and earth intersected. Eden was a place of delight. It was a garden park-like paradise with the most beautiful sounds and the most beautiful sights and the most beautiful smells. Could you imagine what Eden smelled like? Can you imagine the visual impact of seeing Eden? Could you imagine the beautiful sounds of the animals that God made in Eden? Eden was a garden-like park paradise. It means delight. We as humans were made for a home, and that home was Eden. For God put our first parents in this home. He put them in Eden. Eden was a place where God's relational reign and rule was manifest completely. It was a place where his rule, his presence could be enjoyed, could be delighted in, could be experienced. It was a place where his rule was on earth as it is in heaven. Now, did you know, from a biblical worldview, Eden was actually part of God's cosmic temple? Eden was a part of God's cosmic temple. Did you know the creation account in Genesis 1, remember they didn't have a scientific worldview back then. The creation account from a biblical worldview was the creation of God's cosmic temple. And Eden was a part of God's cosmic temple on the earth. Heaven is my throne, and earth is my footstool. That's temple language. In the biblical worldview, creation was the creation of a cosmic temple, with heaven being God's throne and earth being his footstool. God sat enthroned in the heavens above, and he put Adam and Eve on the earth beneath to rule with him from Eden. Eden was the place where heaven and earth interconnected, intermingled, intersected. This place of the material and the spiritual. Humans were created for the material and the spiritual. We were created for a home that is material and spiritual. In contrast to Gnosticism, in a Gnostic worldview, it's all about the spiritual realm, and it devalues the material world. That's not what God created us for. When we value the spiritual and devalue the material world, we're distorting the biblical worldview. All distortions of biblical worldview are expressions of idolatry. Gnosticism is an idolatry of the spiritual realm because it distorts the real perspective and purpose of the spiritual realm. By devaluing the creation, the physical dimension, the material dimension of creation, it actually distorts the biblical understanding of the spiritual realm. Likewise, materialism is a devaluing of the spiritual realm by focusing exclusively on the material realm. And when you do that, you also have a dysfunction, an expression of idolatry, a distortion of the biblical worldview. God created us, image bearers, to dwell in heaven on earth. That's the biblical perspective. That's the biblical worldview, that human beings were made for Eden. They were made for heaven on earth, under the reign and the rule of God, enjoying the presence of God. They're made to be delighted in. They're made to delight in God. We were made for Eden. Point two, we were also made for relationship. God made us for relationship, for oneness with Him, for oneness, for intimacy, for knowing Him, for being His beloved, for being in a covenant relationship with Him where He calls us His beloved. We were made to be His beloved. You were made, I was made to be His beloved. We were made to fall in love with Him with all of our heart and soul and mind and strength. We were made for love. We were made to be in love and to have someone in love with us, first God. You were made, I was made, we were made as image bearers for relationship. But relationship not just with God, but relationship in community, represented first by Adam and Eve. It wasn't good for Adam to be alone. He needed community. He needed relationships with other image bearers. We are not just made for God, and we are not just made for people. Both are, once again, distortions of the biblical worldview. If I say we're just made for God, we're left with a privatized spirituality, where it's just me and my relationship with God. That's why I exist. That is an expression of idolatry, because it's a distortion of the biblical worldview. I'm just made for relationships with people. I'm just made to be with people and have relationships with people. I don't need God. I find fulfillment just in people. Could be your children, could be a spouse, could be friends. That is idolatry. We're not just made for God, and we're not just made for people. We're made for relationship with God and people. So we're made for Eden, heaven on earth. We're made for relationship with God and people. And third, we're made for rulership. I prefer the word stewardship, but we're made for rulership. As beloved sons and daughters, intended to live in heaven on earth, in intimacy with Abba, in intimacy in community. Together, we are made to share in the King's rule and reign over creation. When God gives dominion to male and female image bearers, He is sharing His rule and reign over creation. He's a God who shares His power. He's a God who shares His authority. He gives authority out of His generous goodness, out of His kindness, out of His desire for relationship with His image bearers, His sons and daughters, out of a desire to see them as a community, as a family, share in His governance of creation. He gives authority to His image bearers. We are made to share in the King's rule and reign over creation. He tells Adam, and Eve joins him in this role, to cultivate the garden he put them in and to watch over it. As those who share in the reign and rule of the King over creation, they were responsible from this place of intimate relationship to cultivate, to watch over what God entrusted to them. Hence, stewardship. That the rulership is a stewardship. That the rulership is actually a order of stewardship flowing from intimacy with God and relationship and community. There's counterfeits to this as well. We were not created to lord over others or created to be lorded over. The world system functions on a pendulum of ruling over, dictatorship, dominance, micromanaging control, to being lorded over, oppressed, enslaved, treated like a doormat, treated with contempt, treated less than. And all of us have lived in a world where we've experienced this world system, which distorts the biblical view of God, which distorts the biblical purpose for man, for woman, for us as image bearers, male and female, Jew and Gentile. And it can take a while in our journey of restoration to untangle ourselves from these distortions. I'm someone still being untangled from these distortions of who God is. Untangled from these distortions of the biblical worldview, of living in heaven on earth, of living in relationship with God and community as central to the meaning of life, and of using authority for the purpose of caring for creation, caring for people, stewarding by cultivating and by watching over what God has entrusted. To me, this applies to every one of us. And the rest of the biblical story, after the fall of humankind from this life in Eden, from this life of heaven on earth, from this life of oneness with God and people, to exile, alienation, sin, suffering, pain, hurt, division. We see this story escalating with Cain and Abel, the first murder. We see the story continue to unravel as they move farther and farther away from life in Eden and farther away from the meaning of life and relationships, to the point where the whole earth has become violent. They're raping the earth. They're destroying each other. No longer living in relationship, but destroying relationships. Destroying themselves. And God regrets. He has so much pain in his heart, so much suffering in his heart, so much agony in his heart that he uses this emotional language of regret for making man. He was devastated. He was devastated. God's perfection is not God's stoicness. God's perfection does not mean he doesn't feel pain and suffers as humanity groans, as creation groans. God's perfection is his relational wholeness. God's perfection is his love, which flows all of his attributes, including his judgments. But when humankind is exiled from the land of Eden and alienated in their fundamental relationships and uses their power to rule, to overlord, and to create systems of tyranny, systems of oppression, God starts over. Not because he hated those people, because that's not what he dreamed of. He dreamed to have a family that lived in heaven on earth together, to be one with him and one with each other, to share in his rule and reign over creation. Now, there's some implications that I want to share about the biblical worldview of the cosmos being a temple, and Eden being the sanctuary of his cosmic temple on earth. The first implication is that when Satan went into the garden, he went into a sanctuary of God's temple and exalted himself to be worshipped as God. Sound familiar? There's nothing new under the sun. He goes into the Garden of Eden and sets himself up to be worshipped as God by the image bearers that God made. Idolatry, Satan's idolatry, which he deceived humankind into following, is idolatry that happens inside God's temple. All human idolatry on the earth from time beginning is happening in God's cosmic temple. Humans are setting themselves up to be worshipped as God within God's created cosmic temple. So even the biblical view of human idolatry and sin, when placed in the context of this creation where heaven is his throne and earth is his footstool, it frames the relational horror of idolatry. And because this earth is part of God's cosmic temple, well, the first exile was Eden, but the first destruction of the temple was the cataclysmic flood in Noah's time. That was actually the first destruction of a temple made by God. In ancient Jewish scholarship and today's Christian scholarship, this interpretation of the cosmos being a temple is fully recognized. This isn't a Richard Cleary interpretation. This is a interpretation that has strong ancient support and support in today's best scholarship of the Jewish background of the scriptures, of the Near Eastern background of the Tanakh. Both in the ancient Jewish perspective and in modern scholarship, the earth is seen as the outer court. The earth and the sea is seen as the outer court. The visible heavens as the inner court, and the invisible dimension where God's throne is as the Holy of Holies. That God created this tripartite creation to be a dwelling place for his presence, to be a place where the spiritual and the physical came together, where heaven was on earth, where humans had oneness with God and each other on earth in God's holy temple, where humans shared in God's rule and reign over creation. So this is the biblical worldview. So when, after the destruction of the earth, and the waters eventually, by the mercies of God, were parted, were separated from the dry land. Sound familiar? Sound like a new creation? Yeah, it is a new creation. God is rebuilding this outer court of the cosmic temple. He's actually rebuilding the temple he made. This is the first rebuilding, which in the end times biblical scenario, this also helps us to look forward to why the cleansing of fire at the end of the age. Well, God is going to cleanse the heavens and the earth with fire, because he's cleansing in grand finality his temple. So when it says at the end, even after the millennial kingdom, where it says he makes a new heaven and new earth, this is the last rebuilding of the temple. Not a replacement of creation, but a rebuilding into the final dwelling place, the transformation. So that what? So that his dream as a father can be fulfilled. To dwell with a family, heaven on earth, being one with them, together as a family, so that together they can rule and reign forever. So that's the first two chapters of Genesis, and really the last two chapters of Genesis. And this helps us to better understand the purpose of the election of Israel. The story of Israel is the story of God's election of Israel, this choosing of Israel, in order to restore all of humanity back to Eden. That's why he chose Abraham, where God's reign was on earth as it is in heaven, where there's oneness with God and his family, where there was shared rulership over the earth. That's why I suggest he chose Abraham. Remember, the story of Abraham picks up in what chapter? Chapter 12. What's the main story before that? It's the Tower of what? Babel. Now, in the ancient world, what they would do is they would build ziggurats. Who's ever seen pictures of ziggurats? Ziggurats were built up into the heavens. Really fascinating architecture. They built them up into the heavens. And people get confused of the purpose of it sometimes because they're not looking at it from the ancient historical context. In the ancient historical context, they built temples adjacent to the ziggurat, so that the gods could come down the stairs of the ziggurat, down to earth in the temple, and be worshipped by the worshipers. That's what happens before the choosing of Abraham. They were trying to make a name for themselves. God was releasing his name onto the earth, and he chose a people that he would use to restore heaven to earth. The land of Israel was a first fruits, a down payment to turn the whole world into his kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. Israel was chosen to bring the nations back to God, which also meant back into the family with them, which also meant sharing in the stewardship of being in this intimate relationship with God and ruling and reigning over creation in their human vocation of stewardship. Their human covenantal vocation of stewardship, of cultivating, of watching over, serving and guarding God's creation. Most importantly, their relationships. Serving and guarding their relationships with God and each other. But also extended to their service to all creation. I want to say one more thing about image bearers and we'll close. In the ancient world, there was a concept of image bearers outside of Israel. Now, what's contrasting is that in pagan nations outside of Israel, generally speaking, only the kings were image bearers of the gods. Only the kings were image bearers of the gods. Meaning the people of those nations were not seen as image bearers. So in the biblical worldview, when Israel is getting this revelation of the creation of image bearers, everybody has this equality of being created in the image of God, to live in heaven on earth in oneness with God and shared rulership with him. Every human created in the image of God was a big contrast with the pagan worldviews of the ancient world. A big contrast. Even though there'd be different roles for Israel and the nations, even though there are different roles, different functions in this kingdom, roles and function are not a determinant of worth. That every human has equal worth, whether male or female, Jew or Gentile. And this was a mighty contrast to the distorted worldviews of other cultures. But what they would do is they also would build temples, the pagans that is. And what they would do is they would make an idol called an image, and they would place that idol in their temple. And they would have a spiritual ceremony, which in the spiritual ceremony, the spirit of the gods would be breathed into the idol, into the image. And that image bearer would represent the gods. It would be a representation of the royal presence of the gods. And it is in contrast to this unbiblical worldview, where we see the picture of we were made as image bearers, placed in the temple of the cosmos, inbreathed by the king's own presence, inbreathed to be representations of the king's presence on earth in our ambassadorial vocation in creation. To live with the King, heaven on earth. To live back in Eden is God's dream for us. To live in oneness with God and his family, and to fulfill this ambassadorial covenantal vocation of being representations of the King's royal presence by his inbreathed ruach, And our whole journey in following Yeshua is a process of restoration. We're going back east to Eden. We're going back home. We're going back to oneness. We're going back to rulership. From a place of intimacy and service and humility. So I hope that helps some of you. Johannes, why don't you come on up, brother? So, Father, you created us in your image. And you are restoring that image in us. So I pray that you would help us be fully restored in that image, conformed to the image of your Son. Just thank you for creating us. Thank you for valuing us. Thank you for paying the price of your Son's blood for us. To redeem us as your image bearers. To restore us fully to what you created us for. For Eden, for oneness, for rulership. B'Shem Yeshua. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Shall we all stand? Hold the hands of someone near you. Hallelujah.
You want to hold hands?
Yeah, sure.
We're
Hallelujah.
secure men.
Absolutely. It's good. Yes. Amen. We're all created for relationship. Hallelujah. Yivarechach Adonai vayishmarecha. Yaher Adonai panav elecha vichunecha. V'yasem lecha. Yesa Adonai panav elecha vichunecha. V'yasem lecha shalom. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord cause his face to shine upon you. May the Lord be gracious to you. May he be gracious to you. May he lift up his countenance, his beauty, his favor upon you. And may he give you his peace. Shabbat shalom. Those of you needing some prayer, we'll have our prayer ministry team up here. Come on forward.